Dear friends and colleagues, welcome to this seminar, welcome to Scas, welcome on behalf of the 18th century, the interdisciplinary seminar in 18th century studies. And the principal of Scas, Professor Björn Wittrock, has asked me to speak first, so I will try to do so. Welcome to you all, and not least, welcome to our speaker today, Dr. Elise Dermineur from Scas and from Umeå University. But she was born in France, born and raised in France. Our subject today will be Queen Lovisa Ulrika and politics. But allow me, first of all, to say a few words about this seminar that owes so much to the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study, to Scas, and I turn to Professor Björn Wittrock here. I started this seminar 21 years ago when I was a fellow at Scas for the first time, 1995. And you know, today there are interdisciplinary seminars all over the place in Uppsala. This was not so in 1995. I could not have started such a seminar without the generous support which I received from Scas, from Björn Wittrock, from the late Bo Gustafsson. And over the years, we have had many joint seminars, Scas and the 18th century seminar. And well, today for me is a rather special day because this will be the last 18th century seminar that I chair myself. And I would like to say that the goals of this seminar, they have been very much indebted to Scas. One main goal, creating a meeting place across different sorts of boundaries of place and discipline and generation, trying to work for young scholars. And another goal or ideal, trying to unite high scholarly quality with a friendly and warm atmosphere, the atmosphere which I encountered at Scas. So I feel deeply, deeply grateful to Scas and to Björn Wittrock. This is the last seminar that I chair personally, but it is not the end of the 18th century seminar. The seminar will continue, and I'm happy that Docent Ann Örberg from the Department of Literature, there she is, she has accepted to take over the seminar after me from the 1st of January. She's at the moment the head of the Department of Literature at Uppsala University. She has done important research on 18th century Swedish women writers and also 18th century Swedish religious dissidents. And 2 days ago, the formal decision was taken by the Department of Literature. The seminar will be continued. The Department of Literature, which has funded the seminar for the last years. The 18th century seminar has collaborated with a number of departments from Uppsala University, and one is the history department. And today, this is a joint seminar, Scas, the 18th century seminar, the history department. We have a long-standing collaboration. Many years ago, I organized seminars together with Professor Jan Lindegren, who is sitting here. And for the last years, I have collaborated with Professor Maria Ågren, who is here. I'm very happy, once again, that we can have this together. There are several members of this department here today. And in a moment, Maria is going to present our speaker, Elise Dermineur. Maria and Elise have worked together. And so, Maria.
Dear friends, it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to this jointly organized seminar, organized by Scas, the Seminar for 18th Century Studies, and by my own department, the History Department. It is an even greater pleasure to introduce to you Elise Dermineur. Elise is a French historian, as we have already heard, with exams from the universities of Strasbourg and Purdue. She has worked at the European University Institute in Florence, at Lund University in southern Sweden, and she is at present employed at Umeå University in the north of Sweden. Elise's work deals mainly with early modern French rural society, and it addresses questions at the intersection of social history, economic history, legal history, and gender history. Thus, she has written prolifically about women's economic agency in rural communities in eastern France, looking in particular at their involvement in credit networks and what this meant to their position in society. Her results show, among other things, that marital status had a profound impact on women's agency. That is to say, contrary to what law and learned discourse would have us believe, marriage strengthened women's agency rather than the opposite. And this is indeed in line with other recent scholarship suggesting that marital status was at least as important as gender, if not more important, and so for both men and women in early modern society. And while at Scas, Elise has further developed these interests to encompass credit more broadly, as well as a theoretical interest in the relationship between value and exchange as more theoretical concepts. But even if her main focus is on the ways in which French rural society worked, Elise also has an interest in political history and in the configurations of gender and power. And it is in this context that her book on Queen Lovisa Ulrika of Sweden should be seen, and we will shortly hear more about this magnificent woman, but first of all I give the word to Björn Wittrock.
Dear colleagues and friends, I will try to avoid prolonging this too much and try to avoid preventing Elise from speaking as much as I can. It's very hard not to be a bit nostalgic and when on an occasion like this, because when Marie-Christine refers to the birth of the seminar, you refer to an important period in our own history. There were actually three elements that somehow came together precisely in the year when you was a fellow, 95-96. One was the important birth of this seminar, and I say one or two words more about that. And actually we had in the house at that moment, together with you, some rather prominent scholars. One would have been Joan Landis, the author of important work on women in the public sphere in the age of the French Revolution. Another one was the late Robert Wokeley, who was intensely working on both his edition of Rousseau's Complete Correspondence, but also on the Cambridge History of 18th Century Political Thought, a book that came out when actually Robert was dying, but he saw the book before he died. I want to mention also two other events that occurred at that time. So one was discussions we were having concerning ways in which the Collegium could be involved in strengthening the role of young scholars, and you mentioned the role of the 18th century seminar in that respect, but this is precisely the time when we had entered into discussions with Riksbanken's Jubileumsfond about possible joint initiatives, something that came to fruition a couple of years later with the creation of the Professura Scientia program. And I'm very happy that Elise now somehow brings these streams together in her work, and being a Professura Scientia scholar, and I will not add anything to what Maria said about the characterization of Elise's profile. I had the pleasure of being involved actually with the selection process at Umeå University, which brought Elise there once. And I'm very, very happy that she's now one of the key persons in the Professura Scientia program. But we also had at that time discussions about the role of the social sciences and the humanities in the contemporary age, and the degree to which they were, or rather were not, conceptually prepared for understanding and addressing the world in which we are living now and its challenges. So at that time, Shmuel Eisenstadt, the late Shmuel Eisenstadt, Wolfgang Schluchte, one of the editors of Weber's complete works, and I were trying to think about ways in which we could not just paraphrase or quote Weber, but engage in an investigation in his spirit in another age. And one very important element was a workshop we had in Uppsala actually in the late spring of 1996, bringing together a number of people thinking about modern societies in a much more long-term historical perspective. Among them were Sheldon Pollock and Sanjay Subramaniam and a range of other scholars. And 2 years later, we published this work in a special issue of the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Daedalus, on early modernities. And we have continued that work. And we had a workshop in which Margaret Hunt was participating only this year on empires, trades, and networks in the 17th and 18th centuries. And this is a work we'll carry on, and which I think is crucial for the further development of not our particular work, but initiatives along these lines. It's crucial for the future possibilities of the social sciences to say something about the world in which we live. And we look upon the 18th century seminar as a close ally in this work. So much for that, but it is a very nice occasion. I also would like to say that about Marie-Christine, that of course you are a literary scholar by training, and you have a chair in literature, or what used to be literary history of literature, but your own research has really spanned across very wide fields. So you're well known for your work on theatre, on rhetoric, and I will not quote all the large number of works you have published in this field. One book, actually, the book on the birth of the Swedish opera, being written during a previous period of residence of you in the Collegium. But also, and this relates to what I said about understanding our contemporary era, also about your important work historically to locate some of the key notions often used in a much too light-hearted fashion by contemporary social scientists, namely works on the public sphere and its meaning, and what does public sphere actually mean in different societies. Actually, other persons who were involved in this early work that Shmuel and Schluchter and I were working with were people like Beth Barry, who was back here last year, the Japanese historian at Berkeley, Fred Wakeman, also at Berkeley, Chinese historian. But we are very grateful, Marie-Christine, for the constant inspiration that you have given us during these years. And I think it's remarkable that Marie-Christine spans really key areas of the human history of theatre, history of literature, history of media, but also you have brought up increasingly the global aspects of the 18th century. I cannot refrain from quoting a book that came out some years before you were a fellow. That was written by Roy Porter, and a book edited by Roy Porter and C.S. Rousseau. The book, The Ferment of Knowledge, Studies in this Historiography of the 18th Century, where they say that just a little bit earlier, many historians of science had looked upon the 18th century as a tiresome trough to be negotiated between the peaks of the 17th and those of the 19th century, or as a mystery, a twilight zone, in which all is on the verge of yielding, but nothing has yet really been yielded. Of course, in a sense, historically oriented social scientists and political historians, in a sense, make the opposite mistake. they talk about the political revolutions of the 18th century, and they talk about the industrial revolutions, and they forget all these intellectual and epistemic developments that occur. But you have, in all your work, actually been able to straddle both those strands of research very successfully. And I would at this moment want to thank you even more profusely, and I would have ended that by giving you a little gift, and that little gift would have been your book on Carl Peter Sundberg, which is our standard gift to very prominent persons. It would be slightly absurd to do that, unfortunately. But I just want to remind us that this is a remarkable book by combining, I think, the very best features of historical research and imaginative theorizing of global developments. It is based on very thorough archival studies, and yet it is also inspired by recent work in global history. Work to some extent also carried out by fellows in this Collegium. You refer often and very generously to the works of Kapil Raj, but you could have mentioned many other persons engaged in a similar work. So in your person, and in the person of Elise here, I think many of the ambitions that some of us have been engaged in for a long time, and that very much represents what the Collegium, if it is, perhaps to some extent is about, but at least should be about, come together. So I'm infinitely grateful, Marie-Christine, and I welcome future collaboration with Anna Örberg and all the other members of this seminar, but what you have performed during these years is remarkable. And I will give you another little gift then, and I would like you to come forward so we can have this very much in a ceremonial mode. So Marie-Christine, this is a very small gift, but for somebody you know very well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Björn.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy and very honored to be here tonight, and I would like to thank Marie-Christine Franque for the very nice invitation, Maria Ogren for the joint invitation and the nice presentation, and I would like to thank Björn for hosting this event tonight, and of course the staff at Scas should not be forgotten. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to talk about Lovisa Ulrika of Sweden, which I spell on the screen in its English form. I'm going to explain in a moment. And I would like to thank you, all of you, tonight for coming to listen to a presentation about a Swedish queen whose name was not Christina. So thank you very much for that. I started working on Lovisa Ulrika 3 years ago. I joined a European team of researchers who were interested in queen consorts. Queen consorts were these women in medieval and early modern Europe who married a reigning king, but who had no political power themselves. So usually they were married off to a stranger. They had to move to another country. They were very young. They had sometimes to learn a new language. They had sometimes to convert to a new religion. This experience for these women were traumatizing in a sense, but what we were interested in this project was to analyze what kind of cultural impact and influence these women had in their new country. And for this project, I started to work on Lovisa Ulrika because she had so much cultural impact in Sweden. But I soon realized that her political achievements were far more important, in fact. So that's going to be the topic of the seminar tonight. I would like to acknowledge the generous support of HERA. We got funded by the Humanities in the European research area for this project, and also would like to acknowledge the support of Rijksbanken-Jugendfonds, since I'm a professor fellow. I chose to work on Lovisa Ulrika, and I should make a very short discussion here. I choose to use her English name. She was born in Berlin, but she spoke French. Her mother tongue was French. She was called by her siblings, by her parents, Louise Ulrich, and herself she used the name Ulrika when she signed her letters, for instance. In German, she is known as Louise Ulrike. In Swedish, of course, she is known as Lovisa Ulrika. So it was very difficult to pick a name. The book that I've written about her is in English, so I've decided to pick the English name. It's totally an arbitrary choice, but it was the easiest choice for me. So Louisa Ulrika of Prussia was born in Berlin in 1720, the daughter of the king in Prussia, Frederick Wilhelm I, and his wife Sophie Dorothea von Hanover. Please note that we say the king in Prussia and not the king of Prussia. That will change in 1772, but until then, they were called king in Prussia. So she was born in Berlin. She was one of the siblings of Frederick the Great. In 1744, she married Adolf Frederick of Holstein-Gottorp, recently elected Crown Prince of Sweden. In 1751, following the King of Sweden's death, Frederick I, her husband acceded to the throne and she became Queen Consort of Sweden. Her marriage was a very happy union, resulting in the birth of 4 children. The eldest, Gustav, succeeded his father in 1771 as Gustav III, King of Sweden. Louisa Ulrika is probably best remembered for being the mother of Gustav III or the sister of Frederick the Great, rarely for political achievement or political activities. We do remember her for Drottningholm, for instance. It's still a visible trace of what she left us, a beautiful library at Drottningholm, for instance, the beautiful theater as well, the Academy of Letters she created in 1753. All of this is a cultural legacy, and that's what most people do remember about her. Well, in theory, a queen consort had no defined and attributed role, political role. She was the spouse of a reigning monarch, and as such, her role was limited to the production of a heir, if possible, a male heir to the throne. Such a marriage, especially in the early modern period, was in a sense highly political. Dynastic alliances, national interest, and diplomatic strategies were all at once the core and the spirit of the marital agreement. The bride represented a tool of diplomacy, a means of exchange, and a token of guarantee. But despite the political nature of a marriage, the political role of a queen consort within a new kingdom and within male-dominating institution was by definition non-existent. A queen with a crown, but with no political power. She was not supposed to fulfill any political role. There was no institution for her to do so. Well, some of these women, some of those queen consorts, could, in exceptional circumstances, act temporarily as regent for their incapacitated or absent husband or for their minor son. Court norms might encourage certain public tasks for them and official duties, such as charitable activities or artistic patronage, for instance, areas in which men tolerated women's involvement and power. But no official political function was defined for a queen consort. Some of these women had incidentally very little wish and desire to mingle with politics, and some of these women were very happy with non-existent political role. But some others, such as Louisa Ulrika, were very happy to actually mingle with politics, even if there was no proper and official role for that for them. Informally, several queen consorts did take part in political activities in various forms and on various levels of investment, acting as mediators, as facilitators, supporting one faction against another at court, or advising the king, for instance. many of these women could act as political agent, political catalyst, or political instrument. They could have agency on their own and lead faction as political agents, for instance. They could promote an ideological direction thanks to their rank and their function, making them de facto political catalysts. And they could act as a political instrument in the hands of their male relatives and regarding foreign affairs in particular. As you can understand, when those women were married off to foreign countries, their male relatives at home in their native country often use them for lobbying their own interest or use them as informal diplomats. Well, in this presentation, I discuss Lovisa Ulrika's political role, especially. As Crown Princess, Queen, and then Queen Dowagers of Sweden, she played an active part in political matters in a period that was quite difficult for the Swedish monarchy. We need to remember that when she arrived in Sweden in 1744, Sweden was a parliamentary monarchy. And following Sweden's defeat in the Great Northern War in 1729, the monarchy found itself deprived of its traditional prerogative. The defeat in 1721 put a halt to the absolutism of Charles XII, and the constitution was modified, giving the king less power and authority. The parliamentary monarchy then was a regime almost without any equivalent in 18th century Europe. In effect, political power rested in the hands of the union of the four estates of the kingdom, the Riksdag or Diet in English, and in particular in the hands of the nobility. The position of the crown prince, later King Adolf Frederick, and his queen Lovisa Ulrika was a very uncomfortable one. The monarch's hands were tied by the constitution of 1720 that had been drafted after the defeat, restricting his prerogative to very little. The four estates decided most of the kingdom's affairs and ultimately saw the emergence of a dual political party system. The two political parties, the hats and the caps, as they were known in English, rotten with corruption and showered with foreign gold, quarreled with one another violently through the period to control Swedish institutions. In this so-called age of liberty, the monarchy, exposed both to foreign intrusion in its affairs and to a restrictive legal power, had very little room for maneuver. Born in Prussia, where the reigning Hohenzollern crowned themselves king in 1701, and where Louisa's father exercised supreme control over the kingdom, the princess could not fail to find Swedish institution and Swedish monarchy quite unnatural. You can see Frederick I of Prussia he was known as the Elector of Brandenburg, and in 1701 he crowned himself King of Prussia. And the one, Frederick William I, is Lovisa Ulrika's father, is also known as the Soldier King. One feature of the Prussian identity in the 18th century is its military identity, a very strong military identity. Well, for the moment, she arrived in Sweden, and throughout absolutely her entire life, Lovisa Ulrika worked tirelessly towards increasing the power of the monarchy. That was her ultimate goal and only political goal, increasing the power of the monarchy. We have to understand that she came from a land very proud to have crowned themselves king in the beginning of the 18th century, and were gaining land by waging war was very important, something that Sweden didn't do. Well, Luisa Ulrika, throughout her entire life, never diverted from her objective, despite countless obstacles and adversities. And at such, she embodies a perfect example of a female consort who was in turn a political agent, a political catalyst, and a political instrument. Well, the sources that I've used for writing a political biography about her are many and varied. There are many letters that she wrote, mostly in French, very rarely in German or Swedish. Most of her correspondence is in fact in French. It's more than 2,000 letters. Some of them have been published. Some of them are available in the archive in Berlin, in Stockholm. It's all over the place. She corresponded with numerous siblings in Berlin, including Frederick the Great. She corresponded also with a son later on, Gustav III. Their correspondence is also in French, and part of it has been published as well. She also wrote letters to other relatives, to her husband, to her friends, to followers and acquaintances. So it's a very large correspondence. But this letter contains an amazing array of details concerning her political activities and her political aspirations. Well, diplomatic documents also constitute a very important source for this study, especially the diplomatic dispatches from the Prussian and the French ambassadors. I have to say that the French ambassadors were usually very skilled and expert diplomats, and what they sent back home were full reports, full of details about daily life at court. So those are amazing to study domestic affairs from a different perspective. Luisa Ulrika also tried to produce some ego documents, some of her memoirs. She tried to write in French. She attempted that after Gustav was born. It's 4 pages in French and it stopped in the middle of a sentence. So she didn't really complete that project. Later on in her life, in 1768, she tried to write a memoir to justify her political action, and she dictated those memoirs to her secretary. So that's what you see on the screen. It's one of the pages. So in total, it's about 40 pages. It's a mix between Swedish and French, and it's very confused. But she never did anything about that, and it's never been published. Throughout her entire life, as I said, her political agency and action were guided by one unique objective: the increase of royal prerogative in Sweden. This guiding principle directed her political action entirely, and in spite of her biological sex, and in spite of the traditional expectation pertaining to a queen consort, she participated in the political sphere with much energy and determination, surpassing the traditional norms and boundaries of consortship. In that sense, she was quite unique and somehow exceptional. Thanks to the position she occupied as the wife of the king and the head of the court, various people repeatedly placed their political hopes and expectations in her. Frederick the Great, her brother, for instance, through their mutual dynastic ties, had wished to use her as a political instrument. When he married her to Adolf Frederick in 1744, he asked her to lobby on his behalf for an alliance between Sweden and Prussia. And he thought that maybe his ambassador would not be enough, but his sister at court could lobby for that alliance and represent Prussia, giving a good image of Prussia. He would use her later on when Prussia and Sweden would be at war, fighting each other in the Pomeranian War, part of the 7 Years' War. And she would be the one negotiating the peace treaty between Sweden and Prussia with her brother. Well, at home in Sweden, some people, such as Carl Gustaf Tessin, a prominent political figure, had also placed great political expectation in her. Upon her marriage to Adolf Frederick, Tessin had hoped to use her to reach and likely manipulate the crown prince. Tessin envisioned turning to the princess as the main intermediary agent between the Hats Council and the crown. He also worked with her towards unifying the nobility and establishing harmony within the political sphere in the late 1740s. Well, within a few weeks of her arrival in Stockholm, Lovisa Ulrika had drawn attention to herself and had become a major political catalyst. The princess filled, in fact, a vacuum in the Swedish political landscape. Many gathered around her in order to seek protection, support, and/or favors. In turn, she expected them to serve her interests and those of the monarchy. She fulfilled a void as an intermediary between the political elite and the crown, offering a genderless space for socialization and lobbying. Well, she had the space to do so, because when she arrived in 1744, what does she find? Well, she found a power vacuum. There was no competing female court. There was no mother-in-law. There was no royal sibling. There was an old king whose political interest decreased. In fact, Frederick I was much more interested, that's him. He was much more interested in hunting and in seeking the company of nice ladies rather than getting involved in politics. And she also found a foreign-born husband who needed her support, and he needed a heir as soon as possible because his position was quite shaky. He's been elected in 1743 as the successor of Frederick I, but a rebellion in the provinces has tarnished this election. So he needed support as well. So not only she found space for action, but she was also needed when she arrived at court. So that was not the case for all the queen consorts who could arrive at court and find a mother-in-law who hated her, for instance, or royal siblings who would compete for attention. So none of this for Lovisa Ulrika when she arrived. Her involvement as a political agent over the years, pursuing her objective, turned her into a key player, in fact. She carried her own political agenda, nurtured her own political doctrine, and resorted to strategies to advance her cause and gain support. Many recognize her influence, but also her potential as a nuisance in the way in which she interfered in affairs. So I would like to talk about her political achievement and legacy and what she actually did concretely. And I think that's the best to proceed in three steps. First, her political strategies, then the uniqueness of the context in which she developed. And then I will try to assess what did she actually do in practice. So all of this will help us also to build a framework about queen consortship, about the political action of these women, if it's possible to have a theoretical framework. Well, while the value of a political role cannot be denied, it's much more difficult to assess Lovisa Ulrika's political legacy. One may wonder if her action in any way left an impact on the Swedish grand narrative, and if so, to what extent, to what limits, and in what respect. Additionally, one may also wonder if her example was unique. Well, her political strategies. As I said, her main political objective throughout her life was to modify the Swedish constitution to grant the king more prerogative and more power. And in order to reach her goal, the princess resorted to three types of political strategies. This can be identified and categorized as follows: traditional strategies, extreme strategies, and unconventional strategies. Well, she resorted to traditional means to gather support, strengthen loyalty, and reward allegiance. More particularly, the princess attempted to establish asymmetric bond of dependence in which the other person was socially and financially dependent on her favors, disposition, and position of power. In this respect, she concretely resorted to a wide range of tools: letter writing, spying, the organization of social events, gift-making, cultural patronage, involvement in charitable activities, the resort toward dynastic ties, for instance, including matchmaking negotiation, as well as networking with both women and men. So all of these were part of Lovisa and Ulrika's rich palette of political tools and strategies. Some of these strategies proved to be much more efficient than others. I have an example here. When she arrived, she was very interested in gathering the support of the political elites. And this political elite, the one she frequented, was actually the nobility. The nobility appeared very much divided. So in this example, she said she wrote a letter to her brother Frederick after a few months she arrived in Sweden. I have introduced masquerade, and I flatter myself that this will change all. It does not cost a lot of effort. The nobility asks no more than being entertained, and the clergy is so hated by the nobility that there is no risk in letting them shoot about it, as all the support they got from the old queen is now gone. So she organized this kind of social events, controlling not only the space for entertainment, where and when people should gather all together, but she organized that in place. She controlled herself. Upon her marriage, Frederick I gave her Drottningholm, the castle, and there she organized countless social events, ball, masquerades, concerts, dinner, in which she invited the nobility. Not only she could control them, but she was in the middle, at the heart of the socialization process. Well, the strategies Lovisa and Ulrika resorted to were not unfamiliar to elite women in the early modern period. Those strategies were quite traditional. Other queen consorts, other elite women resorted to these strategies. Many before and after Lovisa and Ulrika have used them. Some historians have labeled this set of strategies as social politics, a non-parliamentary arena in which elite women were legitimate political actors. And in fact, this is very important because they occupied this traditional role of intermediaries, of facilitators, of moderators. And we may wonder if their biological sex was a problem. In the case of Lovisa and Ulrika, she organized all these events, she mingled into politics, but it doesn't seem that nobody actually didn't really care about her biological sex. She was the queen of Sweden, and as such, she could be in the middle of the political sphere without any problem. And this is a very important point. I will come back to this later. So I should probably also moderate a bit what I just said. If she was able to organize all those social events and be at the center of the social life, she could not have access to important political spaces such as clubs, coffee houses, taverns, spaces where elites and commoners discuss and made politics on an almost daily basis. She was bound to resort to intermediaries, to other people, and she was obliged to delegate tasks and responsibilities. And this is a crucial point because that's what has caused a a failure, in fact. Well, I should not retain the suspense very long. She never was able to modify the constitution, and the Swedish monarchy under her husband's rule was never able to be granted more power. So in that respect, she failed. But it's not because she didn't try hard enough or because she was lacking any political acumen. I think it's because her network was not functioning very well, because she resorted to intermediaries or people that failed her, in a sense. Well, looking at the political strategies she resorted to, Lovisa and Ulrika appeared in that respect to be an active but an ordinary elite woman. Although she might have been one of the most politically active queen consorts. This is the Order of the Harmony. When she arrived, Sweden did not have any royal order. That would be fixed later on, a few years later. But she thought with Tessin that would be a good idea to organize some kind of order to give a decoration, a distinction to people within her inner cycle, her closest friends. This order has been attributed to less than 30 people, and in the list we can find, for instance, her ladies in waiting. We can find Tessin, we can find a brother, Frederick the Great, and also his legitimate heir, her favorite brother, August Wilhelm. So that was also a strategy to strengthen a network and to make sure people would be loyal to her. But it was a short-lived experience. It only lasted a few years. After that, the Swedish crown decided the implementation of other orders that have been replacing this one. Okay, so she used traditional strategies of socialization process, of loyalty, of gift-making, for instance, such as this order, to strengthen loyalty around her. But she also employed extreme means in attempting to reach her objective. She especially distinguished herself in plotting a constitutional change through a coup d'etat. In the early 1750s, the princess drafted several plans for such a royal revolution. She called this a revolution. We think about a revolution being something from below, but in that case, it was a royal revolution where the monarchy plot against the government and the parliament. And in 1756, she tried to overthrow the constitution. She tried to use force in order to change the constitution. He failed. But it can hardly be doubted that not only did she know about the whole scheme, but she had also engineered part of it, or maybe whole of it herself. She denied she had anything to do with it, but evidence points to her responsibility. So what happened is the coup was discovered, and rapidly the government, the councils pointed to the responsibility of the king and the queen. It seems that the king had very little knowledge of what was going on, while the queen knew much more than he did. So the decision was to keep her in the kingdom and just to send the archbishop to reprimand her. But it was also a discussion that maybe she would be exiled, maybe we should send her back to her brother in Berlin. Another proposition was to poison her, to give her Italian soup. That didn't go through, but that was one of the options on the table. But despite the fact that she planned all of this in 1756, she escaped exile and maybe losing her crown. A few months afterwards, we find letters that she wrote that she was making new plans again to overthrow the constitution. So I don't think she really realized the gravity of what just happened. It seems that her ultimate goal was far more important than what could happen to her. And it was a tragedy in 1756, because if she escaped exile or death. Some of her friends did not, in fact, and 6 people died, executed by the Riksdag. And she wrote to her brother shortly after the event, after the execution of her friends. She said, "Well, my sorrows are not yet mended, however hard I try. My friends dying on the scaffold, the other exiled, are images that time cannot erase. All the more so because their deaths were unwarranted. There was no evidence against them. I had to endure this personal pain without showing weakness or committing any impropriety contrary to my rank and my birth, which might have shamed me. It is this conduct that has saved me and has surprised my enemies, and this is the only way I will act in the future. In the most crucial moments, I remember that I am the sister of Frederick the Great. And this title gives me back all my courage and reminds me of all my obligation." And she continued to plot for another revolution. It didn't work through. But all her life, she continued trying to change the constitution. After 1756, for a few years, she continued to make plans for violent means, to resort to violent means in order to change the constitution. But after that, she calmed down and she tried to use the more official and legal means in order to do so. So that's the unconventional and exceptional political strategies, in fact. Because when she realized she couldn't use violent means in order to change the constitution and increase the royal prerogative, she came with the idea of a court party, a political party on her own. She designed the court party, the Hofpartiet, in the early 1750s. And to my best knowledge, I think it's a unique example in history of a queen consort political leadership like this. Well, evidently the establishment of such a party was made possible because of the functioning and the nature of the Swedish parliamentary monarchy. In medieval and early modern Europe, some elite women and queen consort could head coteries at court. It was not uncommon. For instance, at the French courts in the early modern period, it was famously known that some women headed some group, some faction. Madame de Pompadour, for instance, headed a faction. She was a mistress of Louis XV, and through a faction and a group of influence and a network, she contrived the exile of a minister, Maurepas. Maurepas was dismissed under influence. So she had access to the king, and she could have some kind of influence. And around her, we find a lot of people. And she also successfully implemented the ascension of Choiseul, another minister. A few years later, Madame du Barry, also a mistress of Louis XV, he had a nice collection. She also engineered the fall of the said Choiseul, so she could have that kind of power. Some elite women could head coteries, she could have a political informal role, but not, I think, as much as Louisa Ulrika did, because the court party was competing with the hats and the caps. Now, when I say political parties, it shouldn't be understood as a modern term. It was not a political party as we know today. There was no proper membership, for instance. But they could present representatives at election, for instance. In England, the influence of queen consorts on politics has been referred to petticoat power, for instance. But it was not the same thing and the same strategies as forming, designing, and heading a political party and taking part to elections. Most queen consorts, in fact, limited their activities to charitable or cultural patronage, which in turn could sometimes have been perceived as informal politics. A handful of these women can be credited with formal political action. Most of this action were circumscribed to informal diplomacy, networking, and strategies, like the one mentioned earlier. The fact that most queen consorts did not engage actively in political matters as much as Lovisa Ulrika did could be explained through the particular circumstance and unique environment in which she evolved. Well, every queen consort in medieval and early modern Europe faced a unique context and developed in a singular environment. There was no single consortship that looked like another. All those women experiences were in fact very much different from one another. And the one of Lovisa Ulrika was no exception. The princess was able to actively engage in politics because of various contextual and intrinsic elements that made the environment in which she maneuvered distinctive. Well, first, the Swedish parliamentary monarchy in the Age of Liberty allowed the rise of various political opinions and debates, at least within the bound of censorship. The very existence of the Diet as an institution created the condition for a political forum in which the politicized elite participated and exchanged. The Constitution of 1720, with particular reference to its interpretation regarding certain areas, sparked debates in which the monarchy engaged. One of the few prerogatives left to the king after 1720 was the appointment. The king could have a certain regard on appointments. But the constitution was not very clear, it was a bit vague on that point. And that was a point in which the council and later the Riksdag and the king got engaged into a serious fight and debate. Well, this particular issue of the appointments not only fueled Lovisa Ulrika and her supporters' argument for constitutional revision, but it also gave them a chance to enter into a debate on how power and authority was distributed between the council, the estates, and the king. The Swedish parliamentary monarchy in the Age of Liberty offered an arena for political debates involving various strata of the population, including elite women. Well, the personality of the princess might have constituted a decisive element, if not the most decisive, the most essential element in Lovisa Ulrika's political involvement. She was determined, proud, hardworking, persevering. She never gave up, despite all the adversities and difficulties she encountered throughout almost her entire tenure in Sweden. Her ambition was indelibly the main force behind her action. This, however, should not be perceived negatively. She was ambitious. She came from a country where the monarchy was important, was sacred. She has been born and raised that way. Her education and training had conditioned the princess to believe firmly in the monarchy as the most efficient and reliable form of governance. And she really believed that the monarchy was the only form of government that was good for people. Well, this is a little bit paradoxical because she never came up with a political program, or she never stated clearly what she wanted to do for the kingdom or for the people living in the kingdom. The only objective, the only thing on a political agenda was a revision of the constitution granting the king more power. Well, political acumen and intelligence need to be recognized. Traditional historiography has often implied she lacked both these qualities, perhaps because she never succeeded in increasing the power of the monarch. Some contemporary observers, and later some historians, have often perceived Lovisa Ulrika intransigence as simply Prussian arrogance and female impatience. She was a relentless politician, a skilled strategist, a woman of determination and persuasion. Her plans did fail in the end, but their failure cannot be fully imputed to a lack of political discernment. A political determination needs to be acknowledged and perhaps seen through a different lens. If she had been a king, the assessment of her political skill would have certainly been different. We cannot speculate on this, of course, but this is something to think about. Well, not only did the princess manage to make room and space for political action, but she overshadowed her shy and malleable husband. Well, she had great ascendancy on him. Adolf Frederick's interest in politics might not have been as deep as hers. He would have probably been happy just hunting and have a nice and quiet life in the castle. He let his wife maneuver freely, and he followed most of her political schemes and ideas. In this respect, their relationship constituted an asymmetrical working partnership. She assumed most of the leadership in political affairs. Much evidence and contemporary testimonies contend that Lovisa Ulrika was the one behind the court's political plan. The French ambassador d'Avrincourt, for instance, he expressed deep concern to his court when there was a possibility to extend royal prerogative in Sweden. That possibility lay on the table, and in the late 1760s. So he wrote back to his court, quote, "There might be some danger in granting the king more power, as this power would be totally exercised by the queen who dominates him totally," unquote. And we have other examples like this. When the ambassador Breteuil arrived in Sweden in the 1760s, his instruction mentioned the absolute need to contact and write to the queen. He had to contact her, get in touch, and the first thing he had to do was to write a letter to her. Not to the king, to her, because she was at the center of the political life. She was the head of one of the political factions. She was an important key player. When her husband died in 1771, after an ingestion of many products, you probably heard about the legend of Adolf Frederick and the Semla. His autopsy report did, in fact, report a great quantity of food, not just semla, but lobster and champagne and caviar, among other things. So when he died, the French envoy in Stockholm wrote back to his court, "We have to count with her. She is not politically dead yet. She will still be annoying for us, because she will still be fighting for the extension of royal prerogatives." So that's Adolf Frederick in his royal outfit. Okay, Lovisa Ulrika input in the political decision-making process is difficult to quantify and impervious to neat correlation. It's difficult to assess any political impact for a person who was not officially in charge. But her direct effects on the kingdom policy through social and political endeavors was in effect almost null, mainly because she focused only on increasing royal prerogative. In this respect, her political agenda was extremely narrow. But on the other hand, her contribution to the political debate in the age of liberty was considerable. Over the years, Lovisa Ulrika greatly contributed to sparking a general debate regarding the content of the Swedish constitution, and more especially its execution in practice, the execution of the constitution in practice. The princess and her court party did not miss an occasion to criticize the constitution imperfection and vagueness. Such a debate had taken place before she arrived in Sweden, but with her, the debate just expanded and got a bigger audience. This debate, in fact, would in some ways survive her and last for several generations, even throughout Gustav III's reign. Well, I think with no doubt, transmitting a conception of the monarchy to her eldest son constituted the most successful achievement. Gustav III inherited his mother's firm idea of a constitutional revision to make the monarchy stronger. The plan he developed in 1772 when he staged his non-violent revolution was exactly the same that his mother tried to implement in 1756, with less success for her, but more success for him. So, despite this success, granting Gustav III more power, and despite the establishment of de facto absolutism a few years later, a strong monarchy could not last in 18th century Sweden. Neither Lovisa Ulrika nor Gustav III had fully grasped the rise of a politicized public sphere in the 18th century. The discontent of those holding privileges and those looking for socio-economic ascension and for a more egalitarian society. Of all of this, neither Lovisa Ulrika nor Gustav III had grasped any of this. But Lovisa Ulrika must be credited with a grasp of the political situation in the 1760s. Then she gave up her idea of implementing absolutism again in Sweden. She understood that she had to proceed by step. She could not stage a revolution and overthrow the constitution. It did not work. And she had to go through legal means. She had to go through the Riksdag. She had to convince people that a rebalance of power between the king, the estates, and the council was very much needed. And she was not alone in thinking so, in fact. She had a lot of supporters and a lot of political observers, a lot of political actors thought the same, that a rebalance of power between the council, the estates, and the king was much needed at that point. So at least she can be credited then of a certain clear ideology that was right on the spot. But we may wonder whether if she had been a man, a king instead of a queen, she would have been successful in implementing the coup in 1756. After all, one of the coup conspirators recalled after that failure that Lovisa Ulrika said at dinners, they had dinner the day after, with a few courtiers and the king and the queen, and she said at the table, if only I had been a man, it would have worked. Well, she implied, in fact, she could have taken the role of her husband, who didn't do anything during the coup. He was supposed to go in the courtyard and address the soldiers there, but he didn't want to because he was scared. But she wanted to do that, and actually she went down and she gave money to the soldier and she made a speech. When in fact her gender might very well have prevented her from reaching a goal in these specific circumstances, but it didn't prevent her from taking part to political activities and to mingling into political debate. When Anne of Austria, the Queen Dowager and consort of Louis XIII, died in 1666, a courtier tried to console her son, the young Louis XIV. And he said, she was a great queen. Louis XIV turned and he said, non, monsieur, elle fut un grand roi. She was a great king. And I think Gustav III could have said the same about his mother. As a political actor, she often surpassed the limits of her assigned role and her expected behavior. As such, she often fulfilled the shoes of a reigning king. She was perhaps not the only queen consort to do so. After all, history is full of these women taking part of the political sphere. But she could certainly be labeled as the most politically active queen consort of Sweden. She left to posterity the image of a haughty, intransigent, not very pleasant person, acrimonious queen. The traditional historiography depicts her as such, emphasizing her bad temperament rather than her political skill and accomplishment. But we also need to recognize that she was a relentless political actor whose political acumen was acute and sharp. Louisa Ulrika can be credited with some victories and achievements throughout her life, very small though. But it is, on the other hand, much more complicated to assess a political legacy. If her cultural legacy is still very visible today, making her one of the main contributors to Swedish cultural heritage. The princess' political achievement did not turn into a lasting legacy, with the exception of a son, non-violent revolution, and constitutional reform in 1772. She would maybe have been a great French regent, or maybe a great enlightened absolutist king. Maybe she was in the wrong country at the wrong time. If she had been in the shoes of Catherine the Great of Russia, she would have done an incredible job there. If she would have been in the shoes of her brother, Frederick the Great, in Berlin, she would have been maybe a bit more successful. But that was not the case, and when she died in 1782, she was surrounded by only a few courtiers and her children, and she died almost abandoned by everyone. Without seeing a goal transform into reality, but just in 1772, when it's actually her son who fulfilled her dream. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.